She was 42 years old, standing in the rain outside a Seoul hospital, holding a child that wasn't hers by blood, but was entirely hers by love, telling herself that some doors close forever. And that was fine. She had made peace with fine. She had built an entire life out of fine. But the universe, it seems, had never once consulted her calendar, because the man who stepped out of that black car with the tinted windows and the jaw carved from obsidian and cold fury was about to ruin every single wall she had spent a decade carefully constructing around her heart. And the worst part? He was going to do it slowly. So slowly, she wouldn't even notice until it was already too late. Her name was Helen Paul, born in Accra, raised between Ghana and London, and now living in Seoul for the past 7 years because life, as it so often does, had taken her somewhere she never planned to go. She was a pediatric nurse, not a doctor, not a surgeon, not the version of herself she had imagined at 23 when she was full of ambition and possibility and a fiancé who swore he would love her forever. The fiancé had left. The ambition had survived, barely, but it had learned to walk with a limp. And now, at 42, she was practical. She was grounded. She had a beautiful 4-year-old girl named Seo-yeon that she had legally fostered after the child was found abandoned in the pediatric ward 18 months ago. And that little girl had become her entire world. The reason she woke up. The reason she kept going. The reason she still believed, just barely, that love in some form was worth the risk. She was not looking for romance. She had said this out loud to her best friend Ji-yeon over too many glasses of soju just 3 weeks ago. "I'm too old for love," she had announced, with the confidence of someone who had thought deeply about it and arrived at a logical conclusion. "Love is for people who still have time to recover from it. I don't." Ji-yeon had laughed until she cried. Helen had not laughed. She meant every word. And then came the rain and the hospital and the black car. His name was Kang Min-ho. He was 46 years old, the CEO of Kang International, a conglomerate so large and so deeply woven into the fabric of Seoul's economy that even government ministers took his calls on the first ring. On paper, he was a businessman, a philanthropist, a man who had built hospitals and schools and entire neighborhoods from the ground up. Off paper, and there was always an off paper with men like him, he was the head of the Kang Crime Syndicate, a shadow organization that had controlled the underground networks of South Korea for 3 generations. His grandfather had started it. His father had grown it. And Min-ho had inherited both the empire and the burden of it, carrying the weight the way men like him always do, silently and with terrifying composure. He had never married. He had loved once, a long time ago, a woman named Ha-eun, who had died in a car accident arranged by a rival faction when Min-ho was 31. He had burned the rival faction to the ground. Then he had buried his heart alongside Ha-eun and told himself it was safer that way. For 15 years he had lived in the cold and the clean of emotional distance. And it had worked. It had worked perfectly. Until the night he walked into Seoul National Hospital because his 8-year-old nephew, Min-jun, had swallowed a marble. A ridiculous, terrifyingly ordinary emergency. And the nurse who came rushing down the corridor with calm authority and gentle eyes and an accent that sounded like music mixed with thunder, looked at his frightened nephew and said, without looking at Minho once. "Hey, brave boy, what's your name? You're going to be completely fine, I promise." And Min Jun, who had been screaming for 20 minutes, immediately stopped. Minho stood in the doorway of that treatment room and watched this woman, this tall, dark, quietly powerful woman, do what no amount of his money or his reputation had been able to do in the past 20 minutes. She calmed his nephew with nothing but her voice and her presence. And something in Minho's chest, something he had been very certain was dead, made a sound like a door being knocked on from the inside. He ignored it. He was very good at ignoring things. But fate, much like small children, does not care what you choose to ignore. If you're already feeling this story, go ahead and hit that like button. We're just getting started, and it only gets deeper from here. Min Jun recovered quickly. Minho had thanked the nurse formally, the way he thanked everyone, with precise courtesy and zero warmth. He had left the hospital. He had gone back to his penthouse overlooking the Han River and poured himself a glass of whiskey and looked out at the city that feared him and told himself the thing in his chest was nothing. Just the stress of the evening. Just adrenaline. Helen, for her part, had gone home, bathed Seoyeon, sung her to sleep, eaten leftover jollof rice standing at the kitchen counter, and thought nothing of the cold, frightening, breathtakingly handsome man in the expensive coat who had looked at her from the doorway like she had done something to him personally. The second meeting happened 8 days later. She was at the park near her apartment on her day off, watching Seoyeon chase pigeons with the dedication of a tiny athlete, when a small boy ran directly into her legs and burst into tears. She knelt immediately. It was reflex, years of nursing, years of mothering, and looked at his knee and said, "Oh, it's just a scratch, sweetheart, you're okay." And the boy looked up at her with red eyes and said, "Nurse Helen?" She blinked. And then she recognized him. Min Jun. And then she heard footsteps on the path and looked up, and there he was, Kang Min-ho. In what appeared to be casual clothes, dark trousers, a simple charcoal sweater, but still somehow looked like a man who owned the park, the street, and possibly the sky above it. He stopped when he saw her. Something moved across his face so quickly she almost missed it. "Nurse," he said. "Mr. Kang," she said, because she had asked the receptionist his name. It was hospital policy after an emergency. That was the only reason, obviously. He crouched beside Min Jun, checked the scratch, looked at her briefly, and then said, "Thank you." Again. "It's a scratch," she said. "You don't need to thank me for that." "I always say thank you," he said quietly, "when something matters." She didn't know what to do with that sentence, so she stood up and called Seoyeon over, because Seoyeon was her armor, her distraction, her reason to be practical. The little girl came running and crashed into Helen's legs and looked up at Min Jun with enormous eyes. Min Jun looked back. Children decide things much faster than adults. Within 4 minutes, they were chasing pigeons together like they had always known each other. Minho stood beside Helen on the path, and they both watched in silence. Then he said, "Your daughter." "My foster daughter," Helen said. "Seoyeon, she's 4. "She's fearless," he said. "She gets that from practice," Helen said softly. "She wasn't always. When I first got her, she wouldn't speak for 3 weeks." Minho turned to look at her then, and she felt the weight of his attention like something physical. What changed? He asked. Helen watched Seoyeon laugh as a pigeon flapped in her face. I just stayed, she said simply. I just kept showing up. Eventually, she believed I wasn't going anywhere. Something in the way she said it made Min-ho go very still. He didn't say anything after that, but when Min-jun eventually fell asleep on the park bench and Seoyeon climbed into Helen's lap and closed her eyes too, and the afternoon settled into golden quiet around them, he didn't leave either. They sat 3 feet apart on that park bench while their children slept and didn't say a word, and it was somehow one of the most intimate things either of them had experienced in years. This is the kind of story that reminds you that love doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it just sits beside you in the quiet and waits. Over the next 3 weeks, it became a pattern. Not arranged, not planned, or so they told themselves. He would bring Min-jun to the park on Saturday afternoons. She would bring Seoyeon. The children would tear across the grass like small disasters, while the adults sat on the bench and talked. Slowly, the way people talk when they are both very guarded but also very hungry for something real. She learned that he had raised Min-jun after his sister died 2 years ago, that he had turned down a surgery for his own appendix last year because he couldn't find someone he trusted to stay with Min-jun for the 3 days of recovery. That he ate the same breakfast every single morning, black coffee and 2 eggs. Not because he liked it, but because routine was how he maintained control when everything else in his life was chaos. He learned that she had come to Seoul after a heartbreak so devastating it had almost broken her completely. That she had a mother in Accra who called her every Sunday and cried quietly on the phone because she worried about her daughter being alone. That Helen was learning Korean calligraphy on Thursday evenings, not for any practical reason, but just because she believed that beauty mattered. That learning something useless and beautiful was a form of resistance against the heaviness of the world. He looked at her differently after she said that. One Thursday he showed up at the calligraphy class. She stared at him from across the room. "What are you doing here?" "Learning something useless and beautiful," he said, and sat down. She wanted to be annoyed. She was annoyed. She was also trying very hard not to smile, which meant the smile happened anyway, involuntarily, the way the most dangerous things always do. But here is where the story shifts. Because Min-ho was not just a man sitting in a calligraphy class. He was the head of the Kang Syndicate, and the Kang Syndicate had enemies. Old ones, patient ones, the kind that wait in corners for years before they strike. And one of those enemies had been watching. His name was Park Sung-ho, the head of a rival organization that had spent a decade nursing a grudge against the Kang family after Min-ho had dismantled their drug operation and handed their leadership over to law enforcement with one cold, surgical act of betrayal 7 years ago. Park Sung-ho had been in prison for 5 of those years. He had been out for 2. And he had noticed, with great interest, that Kang Min-ho, famously untouchable, famously alone, had started going to a park on Saturday afternoons to sit next to a woman. Park's people started watching Helen within days. Min-ho didn't know this yet, and the evening that everything truly began between them, he was not thinking about Park Sung-ho at all. He was thinking about the way Helen looked when she was concentrating, bent over a piece of paper with a calligraphy brush in her hand, lower lip caught between her teeth. He was thinking about how she laughed, not politely, not softly, but big and unashamed, like laughter was something she refused to apologize for. He was thinking about the fact that for the first time in 15 years, he had started falling asleep quickly at night instead of staring at the ceiling for hours, and the only thing that had changed was that she existed in his week. He had not told her any of this. He was Kang Min-ho. He did not say things like this. But that evening, walking her home from the calligraphy class, which they were now doing every Thursday, another routine, another lie they told themselves was casual. She stopped at her building entrance and turned to him and said, "Min-ho." It was the first time she had used his name without the honorific. He felt it like electricity. "I need you to know something," she said, and her voice was careful, the voice of someone who has thought hard before speaking. "Whatever this is," she gestured between them, "I'm not built for it the way I used to be. I'm 42. I've already rebuilt myself once from scratch, and I don't have the energy to do it again if something breaks. I have So-yeon to think about. So if you're here because you're bored, or because I'm different from what you're used to, or because—" Helen. His voice was quiet, low, absolutely certain. "I haven't been bored in my entire life. I don't know how. And different." He paused, and for a man who always knew exactly what to say in every room, in every situation, the pause felt like the most honest thing she had ever witnessed. "Different is not why I'm here. I'm here because you're the first person in 15 years who has made me feel like the ground under my feet is solid." She looked at him for a long time. The streetlight made shadows across his face, and she thought, "This man is going to cost me so much, and I am going to pay every single cent." "I told my friend I was too old for love," she said quietly. The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. "What did she say?" "She laughed at me." "She was right," he said. And then, very slowly, like someone who had forgotten how to do this and was remembering with great care, he reached out and tucked a loose lock behind her ear. His hand barely touched her face. She felt it everywhere. "Good night, Helen," he said, and he walked away. She stood at her building entrance for a full 3 minutes after he was gone, her hand pressed to the side of her face where his fingers had been, thinking absolutely nothing coherent. Now, if you're loving this story so far, and I know you are, please like and subscribe. There are so many more stories like this waiting for you. Now let's get back to where things get complicated. The twist came on a Tuesday, and it came wrapped in the kind of news that doesn't give you time to prepare. Helen had known for weeks that the foster care agency was reviewing So-yeon's case. There were new regulations, a new caseworker, questions being raised about whether a single foreign national, even one as obviously devoted as Helen, was the most appropriate long-term placement for a Korean child. She had been told not to worry. The previous caseworker had been supportive. She had filled out every form, attended every meeting, created a home so full of love that even the inspection committee had written "exceptional bond" in their notes. What she had not known was that So-yeon's biological grandmother had emerged. She found out from the new caseworker on a Tuesday morning, sitting in a government office with fluorescent lights that hummed, and the words landed like stones dropped into still water. A maternal grandmother. Previously untraceable. Now found. Living in Busan. Elderly but cogent. Claiming rights. "What does this mean?" Helen asked. Her voice did not shake. It was very important that her voice did not shake. The caseworker was kind in the way people are kind when they are about to deliver unbearable news. It means the court will need to assess the claim. It doesn't mean you lose her, but it does mean there will be a hearing. Helen walked home from that office and sat on the floor of Seo-yeon's bedroom while Seo-yeon was at daycare, surrounded by the little girl's drawings and stuffed animals and the fairy lights they had put up together on a rainy Sunday, and she put her face in her hands. She didn't cry for long. She was practical. She had survived before. She would survive this. But that evening, when Minho called, they talked on the phone every evening now, another routine, another piece of evidence they were both refusing to examine. She told him. Not because she wanted him to fix it. She was not a woman who needed things fixed. She told him because he had become the person she told things to, and she hadn't even noticed the exact moment that happened. He listened without interrupting. This was one of the things about him that undid her. He listened the way a person listens when they intend to remember. When she finished, he said, "I want to help." Minho, not because I think you can't handle it, because you shouldn't have to handle it alone. There was a silence. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted softly. "Let someone help. I've been taking care of everything myself for so long, I'm not sure I even know what it looks like." "I know," he said. "Let me show you." Within 48 hours, Minho had quietly arranged for the best family law attorney in Seoul, a woman named Attorney Shin, who had never lost a custody case, to take Helen's case pro bono. He did not announce this. He simply told Helen that a name and a phone number would be sent to her, and that the person had been briefed and was ready. Helen stared at the name on her phone screen for a long moment. Then she called Ji-yeon. "He got me Attorney Shin," she said. Ji-yeon made a sound like a woman who had been vindicated. I told you to stop saying you were too old for love. Did I not tell you?" "Don't," Helen said, but she was smiling. What neither of them knew was that Attorney Shin's involvement had just made Helen visible to people she absolutely did not want to be visible to. Because Attorney Shin worked almost exclusively with high-profile clients, and Kang Min-ho sending a nurse to Attorney Shin's office was exactly the kind of detail that Park Sung-ho's people were watching for. A confirmation that this woman was not a passing interest. She mattered to Min-ho, and anything that mattered to Min-ho was a weapon. The threat came 3 weeks later, wrapped in flowers. A bouquet appeared at the hospital for Helen, expensive white lilies, with a card that said nothing except a single line in Korean. She took a photo and sent it to Min-ho. He called her back in 40 seconds. His voice, always controlled, had a different temperature. "Where are you right now?" "At the nurse's station," she said slowly. "Min-ho, what does the card say?" A pause. "It says, 'Beautiful flowers die when they're in the wrong garden.'" The silence between them stretched. "Is this about you?" she asked carefully. "Yes," he said. And then, with the honesty of a man who had decided she deserved the truth, "Helen, I need to tell you some things. Things I should have told you sooner. Can you come to me tonight?" She could have said no. She could have walked away from the whole thing. The flowers, the warning, the man with the weight of a dynasty around his neck. She had been practical for 10 years. She knew when the math didn't add up. She went. She sat across from him in his penthouse, finally seeing the full extent of how he lived, the vast, silent luxury of it, the Han River glittering below, and he told her everything. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to be honest. The syndicate. The history. Park Sung-ho. The reason he had chosen to live behind walls for 15 years. He told it plainly, without drama, in the voice of a man making a confession rather than an impression. She listened the way he always listened to her, completely, without interrupting. When he finished, the silence lasted long enough to be a conversation of its own. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked. "No," she said, and she meant it. She was not afraid of him. She had worked in pediatric wards for 20 years. She had sat with dying children and grieving parents. She had held the most fragile things in the world and felt them slip away. And she had gotten up the next morning and gone back. She was not a woman who frightened easily. "I'm afraid of losing Soyeon," she said. "I'm afraid of losing this," she gestured between them, "before it's even had time to become something real. I'm afraid that the people who want to hurt you are going to point themselves at the softest parts of my life, and I won't see it coming." He leaned forward, his eyes, dark and deeply serious, held hers. "I will not let that happen." "You can't promise that." "No," he agreed, "but I can promise that I will spend everything I have making sure it doesn't." He paused. "Helen, I am not asking you to accept my world. I know what it is. I'm asking you to tell me if you want me to step back, completely. And I will. If keeping you safe means keeping my distance, I will do it without asking you for anything." She looked at him for a long moment. "Is that what you want?" she asked. Something raw and unguarded crossed his face. "No," he said quietly. "It is absolutely not what I want." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at their hands, her dark, capable hand over his, and for a second he looked like a man who had been underwater for 15 years and had just broken the surface. "Then figure out Park Sung-ho," she said, "because I am not going anywhere." The next 2 weeks were a war fought in shadows. Minho moved his resources with the precision of a general. Helen's apartment building was quietly surrounded by people she never saw. Soyeon's daycare had 3 new staff members who were not actually daycare workers. Minho himself barely slept, coordinating, tracking, tightening the net around Park Sung-ho's operations with the cold, methodical fury of a man protecting everything he valued most. And in the middle of all this darkness, Soyeon's custody hearing arrived. The courtroom was small and formal and terrifyingly quiet. Helen sat beside attorney Shin in a navy dress she had bought specifically to look both professional and maternal, which she was, and across the room sat Soyeon's biological grandmother, a small, elderly woman named Madame O, who held a handkerchief in both hands and looked, Helen had to acknowledge, genuinely heartbroken. Minho was not supposed to be there. He had offered to come. Helen had told him it was her battle. He came anyway. He sat at the back of the courtroom in a dark coat and said nothing. But he was there. And when Helen turned once during the proceedings, briefly, involuntarily, because she felt him the way you feel the warmth of something behind you, and their eyes met, she felt the ground under her feet go solid. Attorney Shin was extraordinary. She presented 18 months of documented, photographed, witnessed love. Doctor reports, school notes, testimony from daycare workers and neighbours and the previous caseworker. She presented Helen Paul not as a guardian making a legal claim, but as a mother in every way that the word actually means anything. And then the judge asked So-yeon, brought in gently by a court liaison, who she wanted to be with. The little girl looked around the courtroom with the enormous, solemn eyes she got when she was thinking very hard. Then she walked directly to Helen, climbed into her lap without asking permission, and put her head against Helen's chest. The judge did not need long to deliberate. Primary guardianship remained with Helen. The grandmother was granted supervised visitation, which attorney Shin had already advised Helen to support, because So-yeon deserved to know where she came from, and because the grandmother was not a villain, just an old woman who had missed her chance and was trying, too late but sincerely, to reconnect. Outside the courthouse, Helen stood in the afternoon sun with So-yeon asleep against her shoulder, eyes closed, face turned toward the sky. She heard footsteps and didn't have to look. His hand came to rest on her back, warm, steady, certain. "She picked you," he said quietly. "She picked me," Helen confirmed, and her voice broke, just slightly, on the last word. He turned her gently to face him, and she pressed her forehead against his chest. This powerful, complicated, deeply devoted man. And he held her in the middle of the Seoul afternoon, like someone who had been waiting his whole life for something to hold on to. "Stay with me, because we're heading into the final act, and this is where everything collides." Park Sung-ho made his move on a Friday evening. Not physically, not the way Min-ho had prepared for. Instead, he moved through the press. A tabloid article appeared online with devastating precision. Kang Min-ho's mystery woman revealed. Foreign nurse with murky background. Custody scandal. Connected to underworld funding. The article was fabricated almost entirely from half-truths and invented details. But it was the kind of story that spreads before anyone can stop it, and by midnight, it had 40,000 shares. Helen found it at 11:30 when Ji-yeon called her, voice shaking. She read it on her phone, standing in her kitchen in the dark, while So-yeon slept in the next room. The article described her as a foreign opportunist, a woman using a Korean child as social currency, a known associate of criminal networks. There was a photo of her outside Min-ho's building, taken secretly from a distance, that made the implication unmistakable. She put the phone down on the counter. She stood very still for a long time. Then she called him. He answered on the first ring. "I already know," he said. His voice was absolute ice. "My patients," she said. "The hospital. The custody case. None of it will touch you. I promise you." "Min-ho, how do you promise?" "Because I am going to end this," he said, in a tone she had not heard from him before. Quiet, certain, terrifying. "Tonight, trust me." She wanted to argue. She wanted to say that trust was not a plan, that trust did not stop headlines from spreading. But she had seen this man keep every single promise he had ever made, in ways large and small, across the months she had known him. He had never once said something he didn't mean. "Okay," she said. What happened that night in the Kang Syndicate's network is the kind of thing that is better described in its outcome than its details. By morning, 3 of Park Sung-ho's key financial accounts had been frozen through legal channels that Min-ho's attorneys had been quietly building toward for months. The tabloid article was retracted with an apology so thorough it was embarrassing. 3 senior figures in Park's organization had separately decided to cooperate with law enforcement, for reasons that remained their own business. And Park Sung-ho himself received a visit in the early hours of Saturday morning from two men in dark suits who delivered a single message with great calmness and no need for repetition. It was over by sunrise. But Minho did not go home after it was done. He drove to Helen's apartment building. He sat in his car in the parking structure for almost an hour, not going up, not leaving, just sitting. Because he had been through this before, the violence of his world brushing against someone he loved, the irreversible nature of that, the knowledge that no matter how many times he won, the cost always showed up somewhere. At 6 in the morning, Helen came down. She had seen his car from her window. She came down in a sweater and bare feet. She had not stopped to find shoes, and knocked on the car window. He rolled it down, and they looked at each other. "Come inside," she said. "I made coffee." He looked at her for a long moment. "Helen, I need you to know what my world is, what it means. I told you before, but knowing and living it are different things. And last night, you lived it, and I need you to tell me honestly." "Minho," she put her hand on the car door. "I came downstairs in bare feet at 6 in the morning. What do you think I'm trying to tell you?" He closed his eyes briefly. Then he got out of the car. Upstairs, they drank coffee at her small kitchen table while the city woke up outside. So-yeon padded in at 7 in her pajamas, saw Minho, and without any fuss whatsoever, climbed into the chair next to him and leaned against his arm. He looked down at her with an expression that Helen caught from across the table. Naked, unguarded wonder, like a man discovering that something he thought was permanently beyond him had just sat down beside him in pajamas and made it simple. She watched him reach over and pull So-yeon's blanket tighter around her shoulders, the gesture completely natural, completely certain. She thought, oh, this is what it was supposed to look like all along. "You know," she said carefully, "Min-jun and So-yeon are going to need each other eventually." He looked up at her. "And us?" "Us too," she said simply. He reached across the table. She met him halfway. In the weeks that followed, things moved with the quiet inevitability of tides. The hospital reviewed the article, found it retracted and fabricated, issued a supportive statement about Helen. The custody case remained firmly in her favour. So-yeon began calling Min-jun her big brother, with proprietary confidence that none of the adults had arranged, and all of them were powerless to resist. Minho's grandmother, a formidable 80-year-old matriarch named Madame Kang, who had survived things that would have collapsed lesser people, summoned Helen to tea with the energy of a general reviewing new personnel. Helen went alone because she was not a woman who needed to be accompanied to difficult conversations. Madame Kang received her in a sitting room full of silk and porcelain and the weight of dynasty, and looked at her for a long, assessing time over a teacup. "You are not what I expected," the old woman said finally. "I rarely am," Helen agreed. Madame Kang made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Minho has not brought a woman to my attention in 15 years. The last one," she paused, "we do not discuss her without grief. But he told me about you himself. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything." "I know about his world," Helen said. "I'm not naive about what that means." "No," the old woman said, studying her. "You are not naive about anything. That is visible." She set down her teacup, I have one question. Ask it. When the hardest part comes, and with this family it always does, will you stay? Helen thought about Soo-yeon, who had not spoken for 3 weeks, and how the only thing that had changed was that she had stayed. She thought about all the things she had rebuilt in herself by simply refusing to walk away. She thought about a park bench and a calligraphy class and bare feet on a cold parking structure floor. That's the only thing I know how to do, she said. Madame Kang nodded once, slowly, with the authority of a woman whose approval is a rare and serious currency. Then welcome, she said, to what remains of this family. If you've made it this far in this story, I want you to know the best part is still to come. Drop a comment below and tell me, did you think Helen would stay? I want to know what you thought. There was an evening in November, 3 months after the article and 4 months after the park bench, and somewhere past the point where counting days made any sense, when Minho took Helen to the rooftop of his building. Seoul spread in every direction below them, all light and motion and magnificent indifference. And he had set up a small table with food from a restaurant they both loved and candles that the wind kept trying to blow out. "This is very dramatic," she said, looking at the candles. "I know," he said. He didn't apologize. She looked at him, and everything she felt moved across her face the way she had long since stopped trying to hide. He had earned the right to see her face. "I told Jiyeon I was too old for love," she said softly. "I know, you've said. I was wrong. I know that too." She laughed, the big, unashamed laugh, and he caught it on his face like sunlight. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small box. Not a ring, not yet, because he understood her, understood that she needed things to arrive at their own pace, not performed or rushed. It was a bracelet, delicate and simple, with one small charm, a tiny calligraphy brush. She looked at it for a long moment. "You remembered?" "I remember everything," he said quietly. "Everything you've told me, everything you've shown me, everything you are. I have been paying attention to you since a hospital corridor in the rain." He looked at her steadily. "I am not a simple man. My life is not a simple life. But I am telling you, I am asking you, to let me love you the way you deserve to be loved, without limits, without an end date. You and Soo-yeon. I want you to be my family." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the city below them and the small bracelet in his hand, and the man who had dismantled 15 years of his own walls because she had been worth it to him. "Minho," she said. "Yes?" "I'm going to need you to put that bracelet on my wrist, because my hands are shaking, and I can't do it myself." He smiled then, the full, real smile she had been waiting months to see, the one that made him look like the man he was before grief and duty had calcified around him. He clasped the bracelet around her wrist with hands that were, she noticed, the smallest amount unsteady too. "I love you," she said. "I'm saying it first because I spent too many years waiting for the right moment, and there is no right moment. The moment is just now. It's always just now." He cupped her face in both hands. "I love you," he said, and it sounded like it came from somewhere very deep, somewhere he had locked and hadn't opened in 15 years. The candles blew out. Neither of them noticed. 6 months later, Soo-yeon called Minho Appa for the first time. She said it casually, without preamble, because she was 4 years old and had decided, and that was that. She was asking him to tie her shoes. "Appa, my shoe?" Minho knelt down to tie her shoe and did not move for a moment after he finished. He stayed crouched at her level, and his face was doing something that Helen, watching from the doorway, recognized as a man trying very hard not to cry in front of a 4-year-old. Soo-yeon patted his head. "Okay, Appa, done," and ran off. Minho stood slowly. He turned to Helen. She crossed the room and put her arms around him without saying anything, because sometimes words are the wrong instrument. He held her tightly. She felt his breathing steady. "She's right," he said softly against her hair. "We're done with the in-between part. We're just a family," she said. "Yes," he said, "a family." And outside, the city carried on the way cities do, loud and indifferent and full of a million stories happening all at once, while inside, in the ordinary miracle of a normal morning, a Ghanaian woman and a Korean man held each other in the kitchen, while a little girl ran down the hallway in one tied shoe and one untied one, yelling for Min-jun, who was visiting with his overnight bag and had already eaten all the cereal. It was not perfect. It was better than perfect. It was real. Helen had told her friend she was too old for love, and she had been so wrong. Not because love has an age limit, but because love does not consult your timeline or your fears or the walls you've spent years stacking against it. Love simply finds the crack in the wall and puts down roots. And the Korean Mafia boss with the cold jaw and the warm hands and the 15-year-old wound in his chest, he had not proven her wrong with grand gestures or expensive gifts or the full force of his considerable power, though he had used all of those too. He had proven her wrong the slow way, the true way, by showing up on Thursdays to a calligraphy class, by listening like someone who intended to remember, by staying, just staying, the way she had taught him, without meaning to, on an afternoon when the children slept and the light went golden, and 2 guarded people sat 3 feet apart on a park bench, and both, quietly, decided to stop running. That is where love lives. Not in the extraordinary, in the ordinary, in the Tuesday phone calls and the Sunday coffee, and the small child running toward you through a park like you are the only fixed point in a spinning world. It lives in the moment you stop telling yourself you are too old, too tired, too broken, too far from the person you used to be, and let someone see exactly who you have become, and discover that is precisely who they were looking for. If this story moved something in you, if you felt every scene, every silence, every moment between Helen and Minho, then this channel is your home. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. And in the comments, tell me, what was the moment you knew Minho was going to prove her wrong? I read every single one. See you in the next story.